Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 76th audio chat on the Q News Patriot Rumble Channel series. I am the Q News Patriot, joined today by Christian astrologer Larry Martin. My name is SG Anon. We have fantastic discussions on the Q News Patriot audio chat series. We use this platform as a way to spread a tremendous amount of information and interconnectivity between patriots, regardless of backgrounds, and in fact, sometimes purposefully to bring certain backgrounds and understandings together. We're bridging the consciousness of all of mankind in the greatest awakening that has ever happened worldwide. Mr. Martin has a tremendous history that is very fascinating to me, and a lot to say about the current time frame that we're in, as well as the individuals involved, the actors at play, and what the 10 days of darkness might actually be. For that and more, it's my honor to have him on. Mr. Martin, thank you for joining.
Absolutely. SG, it's an honor here. I've watched your work for, it seems like ages, and the diversity and the range of scope that you investigate and have the ability to research and memorize. And I'm so grateful for you. I really am.
Well, the privilege is mine, and I think the discussion today is going to be a huge benefit for the audience out there because the number one question on everybody's minds is what to expect next. We've been through a tumultuous year. We knew it would be so. We saw the very first of this year, it was unveiled that former President Clinton was on the Lolita Express 26 times. Again, that this being the very first of January of this year. And so that was our signifier sort of right out of the gate that this was going to be a tempestuous time. And so, with that being said, we're going to have, I think, a really exciting discussion about your background and your interpretation of things. But I'd like my audience to know, who is Larry Martin?
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you. One of the things I was so blessed with is a grandmother who had a great influence on me to think outside the box. And that led me to my teenage years where I met a beautiful gentleman. You can look him up, Ed Kluska in Cincinnati, Ohio, who was an astrologer. And when he and I met when I was about 15 years old, he showed me on an astrology chart on an ancient device called a dot matrix printer, where he then described my parents' recent divorce and my role in the family when I was a teenager. And I was shocked. This was a complete stranger. And I said, "How do you know this? How do you understand this from this piece of paper?" And he said, "Classes start Saturday at 10." And I ended up being his student for about 3 years. I learned what's called cosmobiology as well as Christian astrology. And the difference is Christian astrology focuses on love and compassion and an agenda that's for the client. In other words, whatever your talents are, we expose them, we bring them out to the surface. Whatever your challenges are, we mention them and then move on. In other words, there's no point in trying to teach Stevie Wonder how to paint a canvas. We can describe the sunset. We can spend years helping him, figure it out. But his best purpose, Stevie Wonder, his best purpose is in front of a piano. So what Christian astrology does, it takes your best qualities, your best talents, and exemplifies them. And that's where I just find such great joy and comfort in spreading the word or the gospel. And again, I don't preach. I have clients of every religion, but I try to tell them that the firmament is where it's all at. In other words, God's handiwork is in the firmament of the stars. There are no accidents. Every moment in time, including my original meeting with this astrologer when I was 15 years old, every minute of time is precious. In other words, everything's created by our God, our creator. And again, I want to be clear about where the intentions are, and that is to try to promote everybody's best talent. There's no point in going over what you've failed at or what you've not done well. The point is getting to your talent and exposing that and exemplifying that. In other words, what if you spent, instead of Stevie Wonder spending 20 years learning how to paint, what if he spent 80 years in front of a piano? We're talking genius. everyone, I believe, has a genius. In other words, the other point that I understood when I was a teenager, and I had gone through my parents' divorce, and it's a troublesome time for any child. But to see a chart that's unique to me, in other words, every moment in time is precious. Your birth chart is precious to you. And when I learned that and thought, all I need to do is look up. In other words, I don't need to scour the internet for proof or new news or alternate media. I don't need to ask anybody else for permission to understand or learn. I can simply look up at night and I can watch the planets. A lot of people don't even know. If you look up at night and you see a point of light that twinkles, that's a star. But a point of light that stays steady is a planet. It's a planet, and it's purposefully in your moment of time. And it has significance. And that's what I would love for every person on earth, every child in school should learn the heavens, the astronomy, the science. It's so divine. It really, really is. And it tells us everything we want to know. It gives us a global view of people born at a certain point in time. It gives us purpose to every event. For example, the assassination attempt of Trump was a very divine moment of time, and it can be proven. I can send people data, charts, where Mars was located showed the exact minute that the bullets flew by. And people that are wondering, well, what's that mean? Where does that go? Well, literally the birth of nations, the birth of countries, every question you could ever have. I helped my daughter several years ago find a missing kitten because the kitten had gotten out in the middle of winter and was lost, and it was snowy, and it was certain death for the kitten. And when my daughter called me and she said, Dad, I know you know this. Where's the kitten? And that moment she called me was significant. And I was able to tell her where to find the kitten. Because the more serious the question, the more the divine above us will answer. Whenever you have a prayer, whenever you have a wish, whenever you are concerned about your children, like I was with my daughter and her little kitten, we're given the answer. It is in the firmament of the stars, and it's nothing evil. I believe God creates and continues to create. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but
That's quite
let's
a
go on from
backstory.
there.
That's a powerful backstory actually, and I love the perspective that you're offering because you're talking about having a keystone. You're talking about
Yes,
being given a gift, being given sort of a codex, if you will, not only of how to understand things under God, but also perhaps how to look at things like the physical concept of time, the transpiration of human events in a broader lens. And I think there's something liberating about that. But I do have to ask, a lot of the
sure.
audience out there, and indeed myself at different points along the way, perhaps even a little bit now, have wondered about this concept, this conflation really of astrology and witchcraft. And I'd like to ask a little bit about the history behind a lot of this. We know that there has been obfuscation within our record going back a number of centuries. We know that our spiritual traditions were heavily targeted for influence by those that were in the post-Constantine Roman days. There was a heavy concentration of power. Power corrupts. We know sort of how the story goes, if you will. But where does the concept of reading the heavens fall for a spiritual Christian these days, someone that has grown up and understood this particular doctrine and has had this also this understanding that things such as astrology are sort of tainted in nature?
Correct. Thank you for bringing up a lot of that history because it was exactly with Constantine that wanted to reserve this intelligence for the church or for Rome. And that led us into a dark age because astrology does require, and I tell my students this every day, it requires your understanding of geometry and history. If you don't have an understanding of geometry, you cannot figure the triangulation of the planets. You cannot understand the original Greek belief that if a god or goddess looked you in the eye without geometry, you would not understand that. And back then in ancient Greece, they didn't have a word for planet. Instead, they viewed those steady movements of the stars above them, the ones that didn't blink, and they saw them as gods. They saw them as deities. They were at an inferior position, looking up to a superior position in the sky, and saw us as lesser, them as greater. And so, as they began to discern, which is a good word for these days, that's for sure. If a god or a goddess looked you in the eye, they would bestow you their gifts. Now, we thought for thousands of years that was a metaphor. That was a poet. That was a poetry. But in 1991, there was a group of people that said, what if that was literal? For example, and I won't divulge your birthday, but SG, you shared with me when you were born, and literally there were two of what the Greeks would call gods or goddesses that looked you in the eye. Literally, that means if you're looking something in the eye, you're born at a location, and on the horizon, you're looking at something eye to eye. It's not above you, it's not below you, it's eye to eye. And in your birth, you were blessed with education and the ability to teach and the ability for love and unconditional love. And I believe everybody has those gifts, but you're specifically given the additional gifts of imagination, vision, the ability to look ahead, outside the box, as well as attention to detail that is unmatched. In other words, those are your gifts. You can do with those whatever you want. But what happened with Constantine is he wanted to control all that information. He wanted only Rome, only the Vatican to have that kind of knowledge. It's too dangerous to give that to illiterate people. Illiterate people don't know geometry, they don't know history, they can't read. They are subjected to the powers that be. We ended up in a dark age that lasted hundreds of years. And if it wasn't for the Middle East, the Arabs, the Zoroastrians, the people of the Middle East that kept and protected that information, we would have lost it. Just like the burning of Alexandria. Yeah, and so through the Dark Ages, Guido Bonatti was one of the astrologers we study in history. And he was right about the 13th, 14th century. Don't quote me on the date. But he kept that knowledge alive. And it literally took the last 1,000 years for us to go back and recollect it. That's what we did with Project Hindsight, in that we knew the Vatican had this knowledge, but we didn't know anywhere else to find this library. So Freedom of Information Act, we had ambassadors, we had people going back and forth, and that's where we were able to bring some of this precious knowledge back. And that was the reason why. Now, for people that languish in that fear that this is witchcraft or some kind of demonology, it is anything but that. In fact, in many versions of the Bible, if you scour it, it will tell you of the different evils and the problems and the proliferation of manipulation. Astrology is absent. In fact, in the New Testament, they talk about astrologers from the East that were looking for a particular declination of several planets. And we've got proof. And I love 107, but I think he's given out a birth date that was meant for disinformation. It's not far off, though. The birth date he gives out is very close to an alignment of stars that any basic astrologer would have said, hey, this is significant. We could find the Messiah. We could find the revelation of truth, love, and compassion. And we need to travel to the west. And the stars guided them. And it's not just that the Bible is some kind of list of stories or history or whatever. It is definitive proof of everything we've ever known that helps us guide our way. And literally, Christian astrology helped the Zoroastrians, the three wise men, find the Messiah. It's so exciting.
You know, that's extremely compelling and interesting. And you talked a moment ago about something that I don't want to pass up too much because my audience will have absolutely picked up on it as well. And that's Project Hindsight. As I
Yes.
understand it, this operation, if you will, was sort of 501c3 in nature, but extremely focalized and targeted, and actually informed by several studies that were done by the Department of Defense from in the preceding 30 years. When I went and looked up the history, it went all the way back to 1967, and a commission that was actually done by the U.S. Air Force on these types of very issues. And so you talked a moment ago about how the Vatican Church essentially erased this record from the world for well over 1,000 years. And when I looked up Project Hindsight, it talked about the Vatican libraries and scrolls and various things that were interpreted from the Vatican. What can you tell us about that project without breaking any NDAs?
Thank you. Yes, Robert Hand, who was one of my teachers, Robert Zoller, and Robert Schmidt, and I irritated Robert Schmidt to no end while they were alive. They were on a mission to uncover some of the documents. In other words, many people trying to study astrology for the last 200 years were actually following false guidance. In other words, they thought Claudius Ptolemy, who was a Roman during the time of Christ, as the father of astrology. And maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. He was a teacher of astronomy, physics, and mathematics, but he never did a birth chart for anything or anyone. So the question we had was, well, now, wait a minute. If he's supposedly the father of our industry, but he never helped a person, he never helped a client, what are we doing? So Project Hindsight uncovered a number of Vatican texts from a man named Vidius Valens, Valens, who was Ptolemy's student. And Valens had a very incredible creative practice helping people in the way that Christian astrologers do today. And Valens wrote 4 books that we had no access to. And when Project Hindsight uncovered those books, it literally was like a revelation. It was like God answering our prayers, where Valens' books helped us eliminate the errors. In other words, when an astrologer reads your chart, they're
Much like a Rosetta Stone.
well, an astrologer reading your chart 20 years ago was in error. The astrologers understanding Project Hindsight are shockingly accurate. I mean, to the point where my practice has evolved from my days at People Magazine in New York City to a splendid array of grateful souls over the last 30 years. And the only thing that unhinged me were the Q posts. So, literally, right on time, we have revelations that are going to help and save us and move humanity to a new awakening, for lack of a better term. And it's all astrologically written. Sadly, my people in my industry that are 20 years behind, they're going to have to catch up. So the people and the students I work with that understand Project Hindsight, as you mentioned, are very grateful for the work of Robert Hand, Robert Zoller, and Robert Schmidt.
Absolutely amazing. And so you talked a moment ago about birth charts, and I want to get to this issue of Q and various prophecies that have been foretold here in just a moment because I'm desperately
Sure.
curious there. But first off, I'd like to ask about this issue of birth charts. You talked a moment ago about how it can be significant, it can be empowering, it can certainly be confidence instilling for individuals that are on an introspective journey and they're trying to entertain very personal notions that they would only have amongst themselves, so to speak, within their own inner dialogue. What can you tell us about President Trump as it pertains to astrology, birth charts, your understanding of this industry? As I understand your background, you were actually heavily involved in some very high level astrological readings, if you will, for individuals that had a lot of clout, a lot of influence, and acclaim, what we would call celebrities these days. What does President Trump tell us?
Well, that's fascinating because what I try to tell everybody, and in fact, when I was working with some people that knew Tony Robbins back in 2014, one retired NFL football player was quite angry with me, thinking, Larry, I don't like the idea that stars are telling my fate. He was worried about free will, and it was a great question. And because he was 5 times my size, kind of Michael Jaco size, if you know how big that is, uh, I told him, I said, no, no, being more aware, being more self-aware of your birth date and your birth chart gives you freedom, more freedom of choice, not less. When we're not aware of our birth chart, we are literally following a design that is perhaps to our higher self. People in India and Tibet believe that that's the best way to go. In other words, stay ignorant and just go about your business and you'll be fine. Well, in the West, we weren't really brought up that way. We were brought up to be more independent. He who dies with the most toys wins. And we were brought up to believe that we can change everything with our freedom and our free will. So that's where I kind of have a diversity from my friends in India and Tibet. But where it concerns Donald Trump, and his birth chart's well known, he was very proud of his birth chart because basically he's born as a Gemini and also with Leo rising. People that have Leo rising have a thing with their hair. So whether they have a mohawk or some kind of bizarre hair design, people have often made fun of Trump and his hair, but that's part of his chart. In other words, his birth signifies that he was designed to disseminate information, teach, write, instruct, and be someone that spreads the information. Now, what kind of information becomes more of legend because he was born during a full moon. People born during a full moon have diversity with their parents. Their parents may have gone through divorce, or in Trump's case, were just very different people. And that created a lot of havoc in Trump's love life. So we don't need to go there. But what's more significant is on July 13th of this year, every astrologer, even my first year students, said, hey, is Trump in danger? And I said, well, absolutely. We saw a very rare alignment between Mars, Uranus, and a fixed star called Caput Algol. In other words, this is where astrologers need to study history. They need education. And in history, Caput Algol was the losing of one's head. And that was perfectly perpendicular at the precise minute of gunfire in Butler, Pennsylvania. And the wonderful thing is, SG, we can show this on a computer program and prove it beyond doubt. It is proven, it is substantial, it is literally where the stars were, where the planets were at exactly the minute of an event. And that revelation tells us what the event was about, what occurred before, during, and after, just like I helped my daughter find the missing kitten that was lost during the winter. I knew what happened before, during, and after. It's just a miracle. I really see that it's divine intelligence in action, just like Project Looking Glass or the Q drops. They are perfectly aligned. Whether they're astrologers or not, I don't know, but I'm curious to find out.
Interesting. So I have another question then on that same sort of line of thought, if I will, and that is Yeshua, Jesus the Christ,
Yes,
arguably
sir.
the most influential being who has ever lived in a singular capacity. Certainly, I think I would say runner for top three in all of human history. What do we know
Yes.
about Jesus, his ministry, his teachings? Was astrology ever involved in that? And what do we know about the time that he arrived here in this wonderful world?
That's an amazing question. And astrologers at many conventions where we meet nationally once a year, we meet internationally about once every 4 or 6 years. And we often ask that question. And I want to give a shout out. If he's still alive, I don't know. His name is Jage Jacobs. And his father did the most extensive research in the last 200 years. And I also want to give a shout out to 107 who has mentioned the birth date of Jesus Christ. And I will say, without a beyond a doubt, I think Juan wants to protect that birth date because those people that are evil, dark hats, people that have only the most ill wishes for humanity, they would use that birth date for their own dark ceremonies. So I don't want to give that date out to the public. But we have the actual birth date from the Zoroastrians. This is an area of India known as Goa, Goa. And the Zoroastrians have the exact birth date of Christ. And what that tells us was that this would be a very short-lived person. Uh, Pisces is the predominant zodiac sign with both a new moon in Pisces as well as 4 additional planets in the same sign. Pisces is the sign of the fish. The Zoroastrians then denoted not some, all of Christianity to be symbolized by the fish. This was also the age of Pisces, meaning that there were numerous, and I mean this goes back all the way to the Vedas, the sacred scripts of India saying, hey, there is this special Messiah being born. And this is a person born of imagination, vision, and compassion, love beyond anything we can conceive. Now, does the chart say he's literally the Son of God? I don't know that. I would love to think that because I would think if there was a Son of God, wouldn't he be unlimited in love, unconditional love, compassion, being able to look at every person on earth with adoration and promise, and literally able to breach the limits of our minds. In other words, create sight in the blindness, create food where there was none, help people go above what they thought they were capable of. In other words, this is about imagination extraordinary. Is it a connection to the divine? I'd like to think so. And in the original chart that we have constructed using declination, computers, and we even used the United States Navy Observatory that has most of our accurate data, we're able to construct that Jesus also had Sagittarius as a rising sign during his birth, literally in Bethlehem, of course. And that rising sign of Sagittarius means a prophet, a teacher, someone who is here to expound upon the truth, whether we accept that or not. And tragically, the chart is also very, very, very conflicted with Mars. Mars was violence, Mars was war, Mars was the symbol of the previous age, the age of Aries, which was demanded upon by Rome and literally might made right. And it was literally the question of how does an army confront imagination? Christ epitomized that confrontation between a physical, brutal, forceful, violent army versus an
An
imagination of
idea.
love. Yes, sir.
Absolutely amazing. And I think we've seen those teachings fundamentally reshape mankind. And it could not
Yes,
be any
sir.
more apropos, I think, than in the current day. And with that being said, if I may, Larry, what is the current day from the view of a Christian astrologer?
And that's fascinating because the precession of the equinoxes, which we've heard from the Mayan calendar to the angles of the earth and the poles, and how the earth is truly, because we can prove it now, flat at the poles, but arced in between. In other words, it's not about flat earth versus round earth, because the earth is, I'm sorry, for those that are mathematicians, The Earth is not round. I'm sorry. Unless you take all your mathematics to the equator, you're not going to get pi diameter and the radius. You're not going to get that. Sorry. Now, for those that are flat earthers, well, if you reside at the North Pole or Antarctica, you're in business. You got everything right. But in between, we've got to do the math a little differently, and circular math doesn't work. So we have to have a more, let's say, 40,000 foot view. So where that takes me is to the fact that we have entered, whether people want to realize it or not, and I've got many in my industry that argue with me, we are in the age of Aquarius. This was sung about during the 1960s and was given by prophets during December of 2012. That's when the Mayan calendar, they say, came to an end. And I argued, I said, wait a minute, if you look at the Mayan calendar, it's circular. So there's no ending or beginning. It's just another notation of time. And that's where we talked about timelines. When you and I first met, we were talking about the timelines since 2012 because they were divergent at that point. But they've come together today. So we're not only in the age of Aquarius, which is about technology, smartphones, artificial intelligence, and where that can take us, but it's also about understanding other existences besides human. I'm sorry, I don't mean to shock people, but I believe God is the ultimate creator. And that creation doesn't begin and doesn't end with human beings. I believe there are other creations. We're going to learn about those, I believe, within 5 years. And it's just going to be about whether you're acknowledging, let's say, unexplained phenomena, ancient aliens. I know a number of people from that crew, and they're brilliant. They're brilliant historians and researchers. They're not to be dismissed. And when they say, hey, there could be UFOs or extraterrestrials or other beings on this planet, or people that are below the surface of the earth, keep an open mind is what I would ask. We're in the age of Aquarius, which is discovery, invention, creation, 0 point energy. Nikolai Tesla. Oh my goodness. You and I, we started a conversation, by the way, if you remember. And I don't want to go there because I think that could take hours. But Nikolai Tesla unearthed the age of Aquarius about 100 years before his time. But I think we're there right now. And this is where I will echo your words. It's an exciting time to be alive, except I can prove it. In other words, I can show you astrological geometry that says not only is this an exciting time to be alive, we are living history right now as we breathe. And it's just a miracle. It really is.
Incredible. So, with this concept then of Q, Q is heavily influential in the lens, the design, and the foundation of this particular platform and show. And my audience is going to be very familiar with that. And the concept
Yes.
also of blackouts, shutdowns, 10 days of darkness, which we know are thematically being presented to us through open counterintelligence warfare. How do these tie into astrology and these current events in this age of Aquarius that you're referencing?
You're going to love this. Future proves past. I've studied every Q post. I've studied the Q clock. It matches astrology to perfection. But what happened to me in late 2017, early 2018 was because I, like many, were just seeing these posts on 4chan, 8chan. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. Who is posting this? And where are they getting the arrest of Hillary Clinton? Where are they getting these details? And of course, I studied with Project Hindsight, who I view those experts as the best in the world for astrology. And SG, I'm telling you, they couldn't hold a candle to the accuracy of these Q posts. SG, these Q posts are down to the minute and the second. Even with the best computers, astrology cannot calculate that level of accuracy. That's where I met Brad Olson. and we talked about Project Looking Glass. And this got me because I studied every Q post. After January of 2018, I was all in because I'm like, wait a minute. They're quoting things that are astrologically good, but perfect? Perfect? I've never witnessed this. Even with my best teachers, they couldn't accomplish what the Q posts were doing. And that's where I kept becoming more and more intrigued, almost as though curiosity leads the cat. And so I kept studying every Q post. In fact, my friends and I, we would go, hey, did Q post today? I mean, we were like kids at some kind of imaginary concert, or what was next. We were waiting with bated breath. And every event was perfect. From the charts of Donald Trump to the birth chart of Joe Biden, it matched in the Q clock. And again, I was blessed with meeting a number of different people, that have studied this, and I know you have as well. And I was astounded at, for example, the passing of he who must not be named. In other words, it was down to the date and the hour and the minute. And I'm like, wait a minute, nobody knows that. How can you predict the end of somebody more than 30 days in advance, down to the second? How is that possible? Now, I yearn to learn everything I can. I don't shut my mind off to anything, but I had to ask, who knows this? Either it's a preordained date, hour, minute, second, or they are able to see things we are not. So that's where the mystery of Project Looking Glass comes into play. So anybody that has read the Q posts, understands Looking Glass, will, again, I ask you, because I'm open, what have you learned? What have you come across? Because I can show you astrologically to the second how that was accomplished, but how did they know that in advance? It either means, I know, I don't want to shock people, but if there is such a thing as time travel, again, I think of my friend Childers on Ancient Aliens. If it's possible, is it possible that we can travel through time? Did someone go back in time, learn this, and plan everything else out? I don't know. I don't know, but I'm curious. So when I'm looking at astrological cycles and patterns, those are predictable easily. We can literally look at a birth chart 1,000 years from now and be dead on accurate. The question is, how do we spike a moment in time at a particular event when we all have free will? I ponder that to today.
Absolutely incredible. So you've referenced then, off air, we were discussing that the 10 days of darkness from an astrological lens actually comes out to the 5th of November through the 15th of November of
Yes.
2024. I find that
Yes, sir.
absolutely very fascinating because the 5th of November has symbolism that the audience, excuse me, will be familiar with anyway. The 15th of November, of course, being the anniversary of the Articles of Confederation and also the 2-year anniversary of Trump's intention to run publicly for president of the United States of America, different from the U.S. corporate government that's now defunct. How did you arrive at that conclusion, if I may ask, and what does that mean for our republic?
Well, great question. It's one I asked ages ago. You know, the 5th of November, first of all, is in the um, spectrum of what we call Sagittarius. In other words, there's a sense of righteousness, there's a sense of duty, obligation, and service. So it is a very divine day. Now, how that accentuates, let's say in President Trump's chart, is that it is also a revelation to the Leo part of his chart. In other words, Sagittarius is a fire sign, as they call it. Leo is a fire sign as well. So when we look at the scope of November 5th, it's perfect with everything Donald Trump would want to have happen will happen. In other words, he's in alignment. Um, if you ever, let's say, do research on the Abraham Hicks material, it's an idea of quantum physics and we are in alignment. Joe Dispenza, a lot of people with The Secret talk about how we need to align our vibration with how we're thinking. And Donald Trump fits perfectly with November 5th of 2024. What is also happening, which is happening in the background, is what we call the return. In other words, every planet that goes around the sun, when it goes back to its original point, from whatever point you choose, is called a return. The planet Pluto, which has been discounted numerous times, is returning. This began our measurement in 1775 and 1776. In other words, the birth of our republic. It has now come full circle for the first time. And
Oh my.
no other country in history has ever survived this return. In other words, the Roman Empire dissolved and became the Holy Roman Empire. The British Empire dissolved in a brutal civil war. And you can do the history. It's horrifying. So the United States will be the very first country to ever survive this transition. And it started about 2020, and it will conclude at the end of this year. So we can measure that and say, well, what happened? Let's go back in history. Let's look at 1775. Let's look at the Derek Johnsons of the world. God bless his soul. Derek Johnson explains how it was the Army, it was the original fighting forces with George Washington that really were the creators of the country. Yes, the founding fathers laid the foundation, but they had no way to enforce it. So we had to go through Lexington, Concord. Those are definitive dates, times, even down to the minute. We've got those charts, and they're reoccurring now. So where is Lexington? Where is Concord? Where is the first shot fired? Was it really the shot heard around the world? Was it in Butler, Pennsylvania? We can look at it astrologically, find the arcs of the planets crisscrossing from Lexington, Concord, hundreds of years ago to Butler, Pennsylvania. Coincidence?
Absolutely amazing.
I look at it as divine providence. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the details of who fired what, where, from what kind of water tower. We can talk about that ad infinitum. But Donald Trump's chart shows he will be commander in chief at the end of the year. Now, here's the kicker. We have a lot of trials and tribulations between now and then. One is a confliction between Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter says expand and grow and do whatever you want to do. Saturn says, no, there's rules. Let's focus. Let's concentrate. Let's manage. And so these forces are going to be conflicting back and forth over the next 4 months. It literally will be what a certain person calls a near-death experience. And I've got the birth charts of Iran, the birth charts of Turkey. I've got Erdogan's birth chart. I know Vladimir Putin. I've got his birth chart. I can tell you what he's going to do. In fact, many people and friends of mine, what we do is we have recreations of historical events using simulations of historical wars, battles that literally were documented, what time, what space, what date, and we can recreate those battles and say what happens if we take that battle and put it in 2024. What happens to the Ottoman Empire during 2025? What happens in the Khazarian Empire or the Khazarian world, as some people call it? Maybe it was called another title in another day and age. What if we brought it into the future? It's easy to do because we've got computers, we've got mathematics. We know where the planets are because they're literally, they're like 14 hands on a clock, SG. They never miss a minute. It's like divinity above us in 14 hands telling us the time of season to plant the crops, to harvest. a time for war, a time for sleep, a time for work. It's Ecclesiastes right above us. And anyone can view this. You don't need to be a scholar. All you got to do is look up at night on a clear night. That's all you got to do.
Fascinating, Larry. And for patriots out there that want to learn more about how to look up and know what they're seeing, are you available for people to contact you?
I absolutely am. And I love talking with, in fact, some of our local people here in Southern Arizona, we have we have what's called a UFO hunt. And we actually saw a TR-3B because of looking up for UFOs. But we also look up at the stars, at the constellations. We look for, meteorite showers. We look for all the things that are so fun to see. Because, like I'll tell any new student, if you look up at a point in the sky and it's twinkling at you, it's a star. If you look up at a point in the sky and it's steady, it's a planet. It's wonderful to behold. It really is. So if you go to www.larrymartin.biz, LARRYMARTIN.biz, I'll help anybody. You just click on consultations or click on contact, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. I love talking about this. I'm so appreciative of you and your work.
Well, I'm truly humbled, and this has been one of the more fascinating and powerful audio chats that I can recall. Mr. Martin, it's been a true pleasure. Thank you for joining me today. For the audience out there, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. I'll be back with each of you again soon on the Q News Patriot. God bless everybody. Stay safe.
God
Bye-bye.
bless.